Perception Story by Adam Soul.
Part 2. An unknown can be anything. An unknown can come out of nowhere. It can come on like a thief in the night. Unknowns run the gamut of bad to good. That's the way of unknowns. They come least expected. You'd wish that someone would have warned you. Chapter 6. Perception of the way life was. They lived among giant and ferocious animals.
Today, humanity lives in civilization. Civilization began perhaps 7,000 years ago. When we grow up, nearly everything we learn is about life and civilization. We rarely learn about our ancestors before. Of course, we know much more about them now. In the last couple of years, I've found myself truly amazed at the lives of our ancestors, especially with respect to the many giant and ferocious animals that they walked among. These animals were called megafauna. Grizzly bears are one of our largest carnivores today. A grizzly can stand up to 9 feet tall and weigh 800 to 1,000 pounds. But the short-faced bear that walked among our ancestors stood up to 12 feet tall, was about 5 feet wide at the shoulders, and weighed over 1,500 pounds. The tallest animal our ancestors lived with inhabited South America. We've named this creature the Megatherium, giant ground sloth. The Megatherium grew to 7 meters tall, 23 feet, and weighed up to 6,300 kilograms, 14,000 pounds.
Jefferson's ground sloth, a North American dweller, was a bear-like herbivore that stood 10 feet tall and weighed 2,200 to 2,450 pounds. Another Western world animal was the camelops. The camelops stood 2.2 meters, or 7 feet high at the shoulders and weighed up to 800 kilograms, 1,764 pounds. The Smilodon saber-toothed cat weighed up to 900 pounds. The giant bison stood 231 centimeters, 8 feet, at the shoulders and had a head and body length of 475 centimeters, 15.6 feet, and weighed an estimated 1,024 kilograms, 2,250 pounds.
These are just a few of the giant and ferocious animals we lived among.
They lived with mindsets of equality.
The mindset of equality says that everyone has their own unique qualities and that they should all be treated the same. The strongest member of a clan, for example, may be able to carry the biggest load, muscle out the biggest root, or be the single most powerful defender of the clan. But the weakest may have been able to suture the finest wound or weave the tightest basket. Treating each other as equals provided fertile ground for growth of the unique qualities of all clan members. The mindset of equality is reflected among many anthropological reports.
They didn't have the mindset of work. My reading about life in many different hunter-gatherer cultures has led me to conclude that their work is play for 4 main reasons. 1. It is varied and requires much skill and intelligence. 2. There is not too much of it. 3. It is done in a social context, with friends. And 4. Most significantly, it is, for any given person at any given time, optional. Peter Gray, Ph.D., research professor at Boston College. Their lives were peaceful.
Anthropological studies show that our ancestors were not the savages that many of us think they were. The studies say that little, if any, fighting occurred among them, or with other clans, not even with Neanderthal clans. Reports of fighting and cruelty come later on, after hunter-gatherers entered the age of agriculture, and the rising populations brought competition to the land. Before then, our ancestors lived in a world where there was plenty of room and plenty of food for everyone. They lived naked like all of life lives. They lived in a land of abundance, where they followed the law of life by living straight from the bounty of nature. If someone from today could have asked our ancestors back then what they thought was most important to life, I think they would have said nature.
They lived in harmony.
Their fires filled their senses with aromas of fresh herbs and spices. In afternoons they would play with their children, and in evenings smoke with their friends, or watch the sky waffle, or listen to the animals. When the sun went down, they would have wondered at the heavens. They would have each been individuals, yet also been a necessary part of their clans. They would have known who they were. Their stories would have given them direction. Their elders would have given them wise counsel. The intelligence of our ancestors would have made them keen, and their wisdom would have made them humble.
Taken from an article on the Bradshaw Foundation website called The Descent into the Cave by Dr. Ilse Vickers. Our studies suggest that Paleolithic man's thoughts and feelings did not significantly differ from our own, and that he was a modern man in the sense that he was not primitive or simple but already had astonishing creative talents.
Author Graham Hancock speaks extensively about how our ancestors had plenty of time to delve into the spiritual realms using psychedelic substances such as ayahuasca, peyote, and psilocybin mushrooms.
Their lives weren't broken.
Why pack a sleeping bag and insecticide when a bug-free bed awaits you? Why carry food when there is plenty to gather along the way? Why carry a tent when in 5 minutes one can make a warm shelter and be nestled down, telling stories and watching the rain? Why fix something that isn't broken?
Their principles were wise.
Important decisions were made in clan councils, wherein all people would have equal say. Their decisions were based on future generations. In more recent times, the Iroquois Indians, for example, made important decisions based on 7 generations into the future. The 7-generation principle had likely been passed down from long before because it seems to have permeated throughout Native American cultures. This principle ensured the continuation of life on Earth. This was the mindset of wisdom. It was the kind of mindset that humanity needs to have again.
They were the kings and queens.
The caretaker position was the highest in the garden. The animals could have easily destroyed our ancestors, yet they did not. In fact, studies show that our ancestor hunter-gatherers generally lived in the 50 to 70-year range. The old premise that they lived only 25 or 30 years mistakenly included their high infant mortality rate. Our intelligence and caretaker position reassured the instinctual sense of our importance. Therefore, they let us live. The garden was an animal kingdom, and we were essentially the kings and queens.
They were growing in wisdom.
If our ancestors had not known that their ultimate purpose was to become the protectors of life, then why would they pass down stories that would cause them to grow in wisdom? Why not just let future generations make mistakes on their own and learn for themselves? The perception of Mother Earth led them to understand that their purpose was to become the protectors of life. The perception, however, also told them that they would not be given their purpose until they had gained enough wisdom. Our ancestors weren't primitive because of less intelligence. The life we think was primitive was a life where they were contentedly growing in wisdom. There is much fruit on the tree of knowledge, and our Homo sapiens species has consumed it quickly in civilization. Fruit from the tree of wisdom grows over generations. Our ancestors spent over 300,000 years telling stories, following their pathway to wisdom, and growing in wisdom.
Chapter 7. The Fragmented Comet.
People usually assume that the downfall of life on Earth is our fault. We assume that humans were made with some kind of a flaw. What if this assumption isn't correct? What if something out of our control happened that turned us the wrong way?
Pummeled again.
It must have been a glorious, perfect day living among all the megafauna animals. Our ancestors were the caretakers of an animal kingdom where they had grown in wisdom and knowledge over 300,000 years. While they're going about their normal activities, they suddenly hear a roar louder than sound itself. They look up and see fiery missiles sweeping across the sky like the hand of God. Like millions of flaming arrows, they rain down and scorch animals, stampede herds, burst forests into flames, and even melt glaciers. Everything happens in moments. Suddenly our ancestors' world is on fire, and the few that remain alive stand dumbfounded with their mouths open. One moment they're on a journey to infinity, and the next they're in the valley of death.
13,000 years ago, a comet set the Earth on fire. The Younger Dryas hypothesis.
The Younger Dryas hypothesis proposes that about 12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet approximately 64 kilometers in diameter disintegrated in space, with parts of it hurtling into our atmosphere. Scientists say that in addition to the larger fragments impacting the Earth, many burst in midair. There were a number of impacts around the world. Science says that 10% of the Earth's land was set on fire, that smoke darkened the skies and set in a kind of nuclear winter with freezing temperatures, Class 5 hurricanes, storms with lightning, thunder, tornadoes, hail as big as a fist, and flash flooding. Confusion and death would have been all around. Sources say that the nuclear winter changed air currents, ocean currents, caused coincidental earthquakes and volcanic activity, and its rippling effects lasted months, centuries, and even 1,300 years, depending on where the impacts occurred and a multitude of other conditions. Here we see where concentrations of platinum and other comet-produced materials have been found across North America, Mexico, South America, South Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Greenland. These materials are the telltale signs of an asteroid impact. Some sources say that the fragmented comet caused the end of the Clovis people of North and South America. The Clovis population at that time possibly numbered in the millions and stretched across the USA, down into Mexico, and even down to the southern end of South America. Other sources say that some of our ancestor hunter-gatherers had become advanced civilizations living along coastal areas around the Atlantic Ocean, and that the fires rapidly melted so much ice that they caused sea levels to rise, thus submerging these coastal civilizations. Studies indicate that the Ice Age caused a considerable amount of climate change across Europe and North America. Nuclear types of airburst explosions happened at least in Polaco, Chile, and in the Middle East. The reports tell me, however, that in general, the southern hemisphere suffered less than the northern. Europe suffered more than North America, perhaps because of a denser population, and the area of the Middle East may have suffered the most of all. Effects from the comet appear to include the Younger Dryas Ice Age, the extinction of some 35 different species of megafauna animals, and like a rock thrown into still waters, its ripples would continue long thereafter.
Assaults from space come more often than we think.
In 1908, for example, an asteroid large enough to wipe out 2,000 square kilometers of forest impacted in Siberia. That asteroid was over a third the size of a football field. In fact, over the last 10,000 years, our Mother Earth has been hit 350 times with asteroids just as large. A car-sized asteroid impacts our Earth every year, and one the size of a football field impacts every 2,000 years. And impacts large enough to wipe out 1/4 of humanity happen on an average of every 330,000 years.
Chapter 8. The Perception of Lost Wisdom. Note, chapters 8 and 9 are perceptions. Remember, perceptions don't have to be true. Abu Huraira.
There's an ancient land lying at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea that's called the Fertile Crescent. In addition to all the other damage caused from the fragmented comet of 12,800 years ago, one of its fragments split off and soared halfway around the world, where its trajectory ended in a mid-air nuclear type of explosion over the heart of the Fertile Crescent. The radiated heat was so intense that it melted the surface of the ground. And within the heart of the Fertile Crescent lied an ancient village of hunter-gatherers. The village was called Abu Huraira, and the Fertile Crescent is the land where our civilization began.
Perception of being driven into caves.
The abrupt change from the abundant life of the hunter-gatherer to the life of devastation would have staggered the spirit of the human being, as well as all other life. The Younger Dryas Ice Age that followed on the comet's heels drove some hunter-gatherers into caves. Caves would offer protection from the cold. There are a number of ancient cave complexes in places around the Near East, many with indications suggesting that they could have been man-made around the time of the Younger Dryas. Cappadocia in Turkey is apparently home to over 200 underground cities made of these types of caves. 12,800 years ago, however, the man-made caves may not have been much more than a few holes in the ground.
Derinkuyu is a large underground man-made system of air shafts, tunnels, rooms, is 60 meters deep, can hold 20,000 people, and is fully equipped with water and ventilation into its deepest places. Depression.
Cave life would have been woeful. Darkness and dampness would have prevailed. Smoke from fires and torches in poorly ventilated areas would cause respiratory illnesses. Going outside would mean entering a bitter cold. The good life was over and would fade into dreams. No longer would they run naked with the animals. Life would have been changed forever. If I had been alive at that time, I think I would rather have died. The only reason I would have stayed alive might have been for the few children who remained. Otherwise, all I would have wanted to do is sit in my corner alone. My spirit would have been gone. In the caves, no one would ever again know the feeling of running like a bird in the wind.
A contrary life.
Most of the people would have wanted to die. The few who didn't would have soon realized that survival would require them to store food. Storing food would have been contrary to the stories of wisdom. To our ancestors, storing food would have essentially been the same as breaking the law of life. Their minds would have been placed in a quandary. Storing food could have been one of those gray areas. The stories didn't explicitly say that storing food broke the law of life. The stories referred to planting. The whole scene of life in caves at that time would have been one of disillusion and confusion. No one could have anticipated that a fragmented comet would change their lives. Either they stored food or died. Weak and downtrodden, with starving children looking up at them, they would have done what they had to do. Anthropologists say that the single biggest cultural change that's ever happened to our Homo sapiens species is when we changed from our simple hunter-gatherer life to enter the life of civilization. Storing food would have been the beginning of that change.
Their pathway to wisdom came to an end.
Life in caves was trying to continue, but most of them thought that trying to continue was hopeless and would only lead to a broken-hearted end. The storytellers had already suffered more than they could endure. Their spirits had ascended with the smoke. They had no will left to ever tell the stories again. Hunter-gatherers didn't have a written language. Telling stories was their pathway to wisdom. Not telling them would leave following generations without wisdom. To the storytellers, however, life would never exist again, not for anyone. The student doesn't learn what the teacher doesn't teach. The pathway to wisdom was gone.
Lost wisdom but not intelligence.
In the caves, there would have been a loss of wisdom, but there wouldn't necessarily have been a loss of intelligence. Logic might not be surprised if people in caves became keen on working with stone. The signature of intelligence is evident in the sprawling networks of underground tunnels, rooms, and ventilation shafts that make up Darren and other similar caves around the area of the Fertile Crescent. Could it be that life in caves produced this knowledge? Of course, this is speculation, but if you had been held up in caves for 1,000 years, would relating stars to fixed objects and learning how to work with stone not have been in the curriculum of your education?
Chapter 9. Perception of animals giving their lives.
Imagine that some of the herding types of animals, like cattle, goats, sheep, possibly pigs, perhaps even a few of the wilder animals such as gazelle, had purposely hung around the caves during the Younger Dryas Ice Age to give their own lives so that humans would live.
Animals may have instinctually known.
An instinct could have told the animals that it was more important for humanity to live than even their own species. During the first 150,000 years or so, when humans primarily lived around Africa, before humans began eating meat, it could have been at this time that animals absorbed memories that may have developed into a sense that had perhaps embedded in them to more or less turn into an instinct. Then it's possible that they could have been instinctually compelled to give up their own lives so that these cave people could live. If human life is meant to become the protectors of life, and animals have instinctual intelligence, then to sacrifice their own lives so that our intelligent human species could live on to become the protectors of life may not be such a far-fetched idea. Additionally, if our Homo sapien intelligence had gestated over the course of many similar animal species, and our Mother Earth had given us animals to learn from, then it would make sense that she would instill this instinct in animals when she made them. An instinct like this would help ensure that someday we would become the protectors of life.
Animals would have heard their call.
To the people in the caves, the Younger Dryas Ice Age could have meant a numbing cold and a scarce food supply. Excursions outside would therefore have needed to be both short and bountiful. If animals stayed close by in cleared areas, then great lengths of time outside the caves may not have been needed. Animals can remove snow and ice from the ground. They can also stand nearby and not run. Dolphins have been known to save divers from sharks. Dogs will die for their masters. I've heard that animals have done this before. It's possible that an instinct called to these animals, and when they heard the call, they stepped up to it, not only for the humans in caves, but for humans all over the world who otherwise wouldn't have been able to live.
The highest act of love.
Giving one's life for another is the highest act of love possible. Their instincts could have called them to give their lives so that our intelligence could someday become the protectors of life. For a moment, let yourself imagine the feeling that animals might have had if later on we began using them to help us become the destroyers of life instead.